lock and load, citizen soldiers of the Iron Voice Society. I hope you're hungry today because it's been a long time coming for this serving. You have to get the garlic, you got to get the butter, and you got to get the lemons out for this one because we're frying up some big fish today on the grill here on Panzer Unleashed. And reports say El Mencho, that's right, one of the main snakes of the Sinaloa cartel or whatever the hell, the CJNG cartel, may be dead after a military engagement in Talapala. If that confirmation locks in, that is a major disruption at the top of one of the most aggressive cartel structures operating today. But here's the mistake people make every time something like this happens. They confuse disruption with dismantling. They confuse a headline with structural change, and I don't do that anymore. I've watched this cycle too long from way too fucking close. Excuse my language, but, living here in Tucson, Arizona, the border isn't a talking point. It isn't a debate stage prop. It's geography, it's daily reality, it's economics, it's culture, it's pressure. And what happens in Jalisco doesn't stay in Jalisco, people. And what happens in Sinaloa definitely doesn't stay in Sinaloa. It bleeds north, right up through my back door here in Tucson, Arizona, right onto my porch and beyond. And that's the ecosystem, whether anyone likes it or not. So when I hear that the architect of the CJNG might be dead, I don't get emotional. I get analytical because men like that, they don't rise out of nowhere, and they don't build these multinational operations purely on personal ambition. They rise inside environments that allow them to scale. They exploit these weak institutions and compromised officials. And cross-border demand that never slows down. They have that on demand. And the CJNG, they didn't grow because one guy was bold. It grew because systems were fractured. It grew because corruption had room to breathe. And it grew because demand in the United States remained steady and profitable. And it grew because political will fluctuated with election cycles. That's structure. And structure is harder to kill than a person. And under Mencho, the CJNG wasn't just violent. It was organized, vertical integration, production, distribution, enforcement, financial management, everything. That's not chaos. That's business logic operating outside the law. And people forget that the helicopter shot down in 2015, that RPG, oh yeah, a military aircraft. That wasn't desperation. That was confidence right there. That was a signal that they believed the state could be challenged directly. And you don't make that move unless you think your organization is strong enough to absorb the consequences. And they were. So if that leader is removed, what actually changes? Does the chemical pipeline stop? Do the financial channels freeze overnight? Does that recruitment network collapse? No. And that corruption doesn't suddenly evaporate, people. No. What happens instead, it's totally different. Internal reshuffling, basically. It's a power contest, and signals of new leadership. It might be fragmenting, maybe, but it's going to be under a new operator soon. So, and history shows us this pattern over and over. Remove a dominant figure and you don't automatically get peace. Sometimes you get smaller, more violent factions, competing for control. That's instability, not resolution. And from Arizona, the effects aren't theatrical. Synthetic drugs produced in labs tied to organizations like CJNG didn't stay south of the border. They're right next door to my fucking house. They've crossed through these streets, all the way into Phoenix, Tucson communities, that never even saw themselves as a part of a global narcotics supply chain. The overdose numbers didn't spike because of a single personality. No, they spiked because production scaled to meet demand. And that demand didn't materialize in Mexico. It happened here. So when people start pointing fingers across the border like blame runs in only one direction, I don't buy that shit. Weapons flow south, cash flows south, drugs flow north. It's intertwined. Institutional weakness exists on both sides, knuckleheads. Corruption exists on both sides, like I said. And political incentives distort priorities on both sides. The uncomfortable truth is this, my friend. Organized crime thrives where accountability fails. And accountability fails where power protects itself. And the CJNG exploited the hell out of that. They moved fast in the early, 2010s, when other groups were just fracturing. They capitalized on leadership vacuums. They expanded while attention was divided. They recruited former military, law enforcement, specialists. They understood intimidation as branding. They used spectacle as a strategy. But again, spectacle distracts from infrastructure. So, the real power wasn't in videos or displays. It was in supply chains. And like I said, these precursor chemicals sourced from overseas suppliers, ports used as entry points, labs set up in regions with protection or limited interference, distribution routes refined over years, and financial laundering networks capable of moving revenue across borders without triggering alarms. And you don't dismantle that by removing a face, my friend. You dismantle that by targeting systems consistently and without political hesitation. And that's where my skepticism lives, because enforcement intensity often changes with administrations. Priorities shift, budgets fluctuate, and cooperation agreements tighten and loosen. Media narratives move on to the next crisis. Meanwhile, infrastructure adapts quietly. And if this reported operation signals a shift in enforcement posture, then we'll see follow through. Financial investigations that don't stall, all these anti-corruption prosecutions that reach higher levels. These judicial processes that result in long-term incapacitation instead of temporary headlines. So if we don't see that, people, then this is only a reset. And resets don't impress me. And from where I sit, distrust, it's not emotional. It's observational. And I've watched this shit up close. I've seen it with my own two eyes, people, the corruption here in Arizona, all the way from law enforcement to the goddamn streets. And I've watched these political leaders on both sides use border issues as leverage tools instead of structural programs to fucking solve anything. I've watched this rhetoric escalate while policies result stagnant. And these cartels adapt faster than governments because they don't deal with election cycles. They don't deal with political, relation pressures. And they definitely don't deal with this bureaucratic bullshit. They operate on incentive and survival. And if Mencho's fucking dead, The incentive structure that allowed him to build CJNG still exists unless proven otherwise. And that, my friends, is reality. And here's another layer people avoid. The financial ecosystem. Billions move through laundering channels annually. These little shell companies, trade-based laundering, real estate, informal value transfer systems. And they embody this, people. And if authorities want structural change, they have to make corruption more expensive than compliance. They have to make collaboration riskier than resistance. And they have to reduce that profitability margin that makes expansion attractive. That requires sustained pressure, just like the noose on the neck. Okay? And from here in Tucson, like I said, the border feels like a fucking living system. Commerce flows daily, people cross legally, goods move. But instead, that legal movement, illicit streams piggyback, always. And the idea that this is some simple black and white conflict ignores decades of economic interdependence. So I don't romanticize enforcement wins, okay? I measure them against outcomes. So do overdose numbers decline? Do precursor shipments decrease? If yes, then something's shifting. If no, then the cycle continues under a new name. And let's talk about media for a minute. Headlines amplify these personalities. They simplify complex ecosystems into villain narratives, glorifying these cockroaches. And, it's easier to frame a story around a kingpin than to explain systematic dysfunction. But focusing on individuals, obscures infrastructure. It creates the illusion that removing one single guy is solving the problem, and it doesn't fucking work that way. And systems outlast individuals, and corruption outlasts personalities. So, and like I said, demand outlasts crackdowns, and that's why my tone isn't celebrating anything. It's watchful. I am definitely locked in on this. So, and because from Arizona, the consequences are tangible. Families dealing with addiction, communities dealing with trafficking corridors, and law enforcement stretched thin and corrupted, especially here in Tucson and Phoenix, man. They're all on the payroll. These policy debates detached from these operational realities. So, it's layered and it's persistent. If leadership removal is part of a coordinated long-term disruption strategy, then it's a meaningful move. If it's a fucking isolated strike, then the vacuum will fill, my friends. And it's not cynicism, that's pattern recognition. And here's where distrust of institutions come in, because governments on both sides have historically been aggressive. The enforcement and strategical tolerance is depending on political wins. And these cartels don't oscillate, they adapt constantly. And that gives them the resilience. And the only thing that disrupts resilience is sustained, coordinated pressure across production, distribution, finance, and corruption networks, simultaneously. So anything less is fucking cosmetic, you hear me? So no, I'm not fucking moved by symbolism. I'm moved by structural change. I'm moved by measurable impact. And I'm moved by these consistencies. So if Mencho's dead, if his removal leads to dismantled labs, frozen accounts, exposed political protection, tighten port control, and reduce synthetic flow, then that's momentum, my friends. If it leads to internal reshuffling and a fucking new name at the top of their little list, then nothing's fundamentally changing at all. And here in Tucson, watching this border breathe, watching cycles repeat, and I don't deal in emotion. I deal in assessment. And because assessment is how you stay grounded when these narratives swing wildly from crisis to triumph every few fucking months. And, and we'll see which direction this goes, my friends. Disruption or transition, structural pressure or surface adjustment, reform or rebranding. What is it going to be? Until results show themselves, I'm going to remain skeptical. Everything's corrupted. You can't trust any fucking body, all the way to the top of the food chain in the government to your local law enforcement. So, like I said, my friends, stay strong, be aware of your surroundings, and stay locked and loaded. Once again, this is Scott Panzer Paulson, reporting live from haxx Studios here on Cartel Corner in Tucson, Arizona. Over and out.